Do you see it now?
No. Should I try to reconnect?
Yeah. Does anybody else have any problems?
I'm good. I'm able to see your screen.
jQuery domestified.
No problems here.
Okay. Yeah. If you have a problem, I'd suggest disconnecting and coming back. You can just listen with us as I start going through. All right.
All right.
The way the class is going to be formatted, I have about 6 different sections I want to try to get through. In between those sections, we have about 4 labs we're going to work with. I'm going to show you some demos. We're going to look at jQuery's site a little bit. So there will be some time to work, some time to have some labs, so you'll be able to get up and walk around a little bit too. Grab some water or whatever. Okay, so my hope for the presentation today, we're going to get through the basics of jQuery. We're going to look at some of the true strengths of jQuery, which I believe are its DOM element selection and manipulation. We're also going to look at how it handles events. We're going to look at how it interacts with the backend via AJAX. And we're going to try to scratch the surface a bit on the JQ user interface library and a little bit look at some of the plugins that people have made for jQuery. So when we're done, our objectives for the class will be that you guys are going to know, of course, the history of jQuery. You're going to be able to easily interact with the DOM. You're going to understand jQuery's event-driven interactions. You're going to know how to animate some elements, and we're going to work today to start from beginning to end to architect a simple model view controller JavaScript application. All right, especially since you guys are going to be working on larger scale sites. There are some other frameworks out there that can do that. I think there's a JavaScript MVC that you could use that you wouldn't have to architect this yourself, but I think this will help step into some good foundations for JavaScript development, modern JavaScript development, anyway. All right, anybody have any questions about that outline or what we're going to cover?
Nope, I'm good.
Great. Okay, so we're going to first head into the basics, like I said. First thing we're going to cover, and after this we'll work a little bit. It's not going to be a very long first lecture time. And if you have any questions, go ahead and shout them out so we can all learn together and look into some stuff. So the basics of jQuery that we're going to focus on for this small lecture at the beginning here, we're going to try to see what it can help us do with some simple scripting. We're going to look at the famous jQuery wrapper. We're going to look at some of their utility functions, how jQuery does looping. We're going to have a little chat about unobtrusive JavaScript. Also, we're going to talk about library conflict avoidance. Let's say you wanted to use a prototype in jQuery on the same web page. And we're going to take a look at the history of jQuery and then start to look at the API. So the super thing about jQuery, or the thing that really I think brought it to the forefront when John Resig first developed this, was its ability to search through the DOM really easily. So if we want to find elements or a group of radio buttons or radio inputs, and we want to be able to see if they're checked or not and then get their value, it's not always a very easy task. Typical JavaScript without any help, we have to do something like what you have in front of you. We'd have a checked value attribute, and then we'd have grab some elements, do a document.get elements by tag name input, and that would get us all of the elements with a tag name with input. Pretty easy there. We do a loop, go through the loop, flip through. Then we'd have to check the type to see if it was a radio, and then we'd then get the name from that, and then we'd have to see if that was checked. So it's a bunch of steps together so that we'd end up having this checked value, which would equal our elements value. Anyway, to do looping, as you can see, can be a pretty complex thing with regular JavaScript. With jQuery, it really simplifies how we'd interact with it. From all those, maybe it was 10 lines of JavaScript, we're down to just 1 line, where we can do something as simple here as writing a selector, and then calling a val method off of that or function off of that to be able to return back to us whatever is checked. We're going to take we'll go through this as we go along, but just I want to show you up front some of its ease and its beauty. Before we can really dive into jQuery, we need to take a look at how this $ or jQuery actually works. So you can think of the $ or jQuery as simply like an alias, almost like a namespace. And this wrapper is going to wrap all of our collected elements, so everything we find inside. In that last case, it would have grabbed all the inputs for us, and then by one of the selectors on it would have actually grabbed our checked input for us. So as you can see, this really is going to extend our JavaScript functionality. It's going to make it a lot easier for us to dive into figuring out what we actually need to do when we traverse the DOM. And the nice thing about jQuery is it's fully CSS3 compliant. So anything you can dream of doing in CSS, you can grab there. So even if browsers aren't all up to date, jQuery will take it and do that work for you. All right, what do we actually get back from this wrapper? We actually get back a jQuery object, or a jQuery object instance, I should say. And that's one of the other really neat things about the jQuery library is its ability to chain. Some of these other libraries, Prototype can do some chaining, but it's not the thing that really brought Prototype to its front and its peak. I would say more that the jQuery is really all about the chaining. It can be a good and a bad thing. Some of the code that you look at from people, I look at and I can't figure out what in the world's going on. It takes a while to try to separate it out and think it through. But at the same point, you can really make complex statements into some simple, easy-to-read system, or easy to keep in focus system, I should say. Not always easy to read. So besides being able to use this jQuery wrapper for finding elements, we can also use the jQuery. We can use like a jQuery object or namespace again to be able to call off utility methods off of it. So let's say we wanted to trim something that's coming into us. We can say var trimmed equals $.trim, whatever string we want, or we can say jQuery.trim some string. It doesn't matter whichever we want to call those. At this point, it doesn't matter. We'll talk more about that later. But it's pretty simple, straightforward. So trim is one of the utility methods. Another utility method we're going to look at is how it helps us iterate and loop through things. I talked to you a bit about how we could shorten down a loop, but specifically with jQuery we have some extra helps for doing for loops. So typically if we'd want to write a for loop to go through an array iteration, we'd write something like this here, where we have a variable array to iterate. We just have inside there first, second, and third. And we'd have to go through what looks like most languages. You do your iteration, go through for a length, and you can manipulate or calculate each step, each iteration. If you want to do an object, the object in this case is set up with almost like a key value or name value pair. And can't iterate through it the same way by counting through, so we use the like the for in loop. And here we have var p an object to iterate, and we actually go through and check each property on that object. So iteration in jQuery, it's got a utility method called each. And this is jQuery's main way of iteration. I'll talk a little bit more about implicit iteration later, but at this point we're going to talk about the utility method each. You just tuck away the implicit iteration for a future conversation. On this .each method, we have a parameter container and callback, so we can go through whatever container we want, whether it's an array or an object, doesn't really matter, and then have a function afterwards that allows us to execute a certain code or a certain set of code for each iteration of the loop, just like we were doing inside that for loop. So if we wanted to, as I say here, if we have the callback function, we can either just do a straight callback like this, which would be a link to some other function, or we could actually just have the function kind of inline written. I would say it really depends on your complexity of code, whether you want to do that inline or not. The first parameter in that callback function is going to be the index for us, and then the second parameter will be the actual iteration, the item or the property. So we can actually grab the value and play around with the value. And then inside of that, we'll have a function context that's set to this. So as I've got down here farther, we could use the $.each or some of it and just go take that as our utility method, or we could actually, this is sort of a dual method, and a lot of these are like this in jQuery. You can do a .each method right off of a jQuery object. So if we had some jQuery object there, we can do a .each and grab from that the same sort of iteration abilities. Just as a note here, not that it's a huge performance difference, but the utility .each, the .each utility method will be a little bit faster than the each method that would come off of the wrapper set that was that contains our selector elements. So this guy here, by my mouse, is going to be a little bit faster than this. But if performance really is your biggest concern, if you're just sort of seeing that some of your pages are lagging a little bit and you've kind of deduced down that it was in the looping somewhere, you can just use the straight old for loop, and that is going to be your best performance. It'll be pretty much negligible. I wouldn't say that up front you need to say, hey, we're going to try to be the most performance driven. I would first write it and then see if you really have to make changes or not based on the feedback you might be getting from users or from your user testing group.
Cameron?
Yes.
This is Josh. So you showed us the two different for loops, the straight JavaScript for loop and the jQuery for loop.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any significant performance difference between those?
Between the for loops and the for each?
No, between the two for loops.
Oh, the two for loops that I was showing you, sorry. Those are just both plain Jane JavaScript for loops.
Oh, okay. So JavaScript supports that second notation.
Yeah, sorry about that. I just wanted to be able to show you how you would loop through an array versus loop through an object. Yep. Okay. So the two for loops here, as you can see, yeah, they're just straight JavaScript. The flexibility of the each we're going to take a look at here. So let's look at this slide. The top code for you, that is going to be array notation, going through an array, and the bottom is going to be object notation. It's actually called, if you're not too familiar with JavaScript, the array to tolerate variable, that is an array literal. And then the object to tolerate on the bottom is an object literal.
I think
so.
Object to iterate.
Object to iterate. What did I say?
Tolerate.
Oh, tolerate. Funny. Yes, to iterate. It does look like tolerate there a bit. We'll get some little dyslexic. That's good. One for me. But back to the question then about speed, just as a recap. The $.each method is quicker. So that's the utility method off of jQuery's object instance. That is quicker than if you were to say grab a bunch of things inside of a selector and then do a .each off of that. That method is a little bit slower than the utility, but the fastest overall method is actually JavaScript's for looping. Does that make sense?
Can you go back to the previous slide real quick?
Yep.
So the .each utility method is quicker than what?
This is quicker than this. So over here we have, let me go back. So
basically the generic jQuery each method is faster than calling each on an object directly.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. So when we, I should have put actually a $sign probably in front of that some jQuery object. I tried to just write it out as some jQuery object. If you actually have a jQuery object on the left side of the .each, it allows us just to call these methods right off of the jQuery object instances.
Right. And
that's basically what the $sign's doing. It's whenever we wrap any of these elements on the DOM, we're wrapping it with jQuery's extensions. So we could either call the straight $.each and just throw in what we want to throw in for our collection, or we could do a grab the collection first and then do a .each off of it. Okay?
Yep.
Okay. Any other questions with iteration? All right. Let's talk a little bit about unobtrusive JavaScript. This is just a good programming practice in general, is to keep some separation of concerns. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard about this. Some of you it'll be really close to. If you have old school web development, you would put your script right inside of your HTML, and your CSS would all be inline styles. That gets to be a big headache to try to manipulate when you're getting into 1,000-line JavaScript files, or if you need to actually manipulate CSS over a bunch of pages like a template of some sort. So unobtrusive JavaScript is really taking the JavaScript out of the HTML, putting it into an extra separated script file itself. It's a separate .js file. And then that is going to allow us to really separate the web page behavior out. It's going to separate that behavior from the structure, which is the HTML, from the presentation, which is the CSS. Now, some of those do get a little muddled. You might use JavaScript to do some coloring or changing, but predominantly you want to keep those as clear, definitively clear as possible. We'll take a look at that as we go through our slides. The nice thing about jQuery and how it functions to help things be unobtrusive also is that I feel like JavaScript can be obtrusive when we write code that doesn't work on certain browsers or certain platforms. And so jQuery tries as much as possible to handle all those inconsistencies, as most libraries do. And then one of the last things that's really nice and important about writing JavaScript code is that frameworks and the code that you guys are going to write and that you write needs to be not polluting the global namespace. So everything inside of JavaScript is an object, and it's really easy to put variables at a top level. Like if you'd say variable hat on my JavaScript file, and then somebody else writes a JavaScript file and they write variable hat, and they're both stacked in there, the person who had the last interaction with hat is going to steal that reference because of that global namespacing. So we want to be able to write code that doesn't pollute the namespace, that we can really set up some good namespacing, and we'll take a look at that. And jQuery does that with the $sign and with the jQuery. So thinking more about unobtrusive JavaScript and just window loading, this is something that can be kind of an issue for JavaScript in general. Back a few years ago, people would write something like a window.onload, and they'd call this property onload off of the window object. And in this case, they would set the property equal to a function. They do some stuff inside of there. So this window.onload is good because one of the issues about having JavaScript separated from the CSS and the HTML is simply the fact that if you put your JavaScript first on the page, it's going to run before your HTML and CSS is loaded. So if you have some JavaScript that's trying to do some get elements by ID or get element by ID or get elements by tag name, you can have some real issues because your elements don't exist, so you can't really interact with them. One way to fix that is put all your JavaScript at the end, which is actually a good technique if you want to make your websites faster. But if you're just trying to code them and put them at the top, we need to do something that will allow us to know when the document object model, this DOM, is fully loaded. So the technique that was used for a while was this window.onload. The only issue is, again, if I have a JavaScript file that has this window.onload and somebody else has this file that has a window.onload, if they're both stacked in my header on top of my HTML file, the second JavaScript file that says window.onload, load all my stuff, is going to, again, steal that reference away. So your first JavaScript file that's trying to call that function won't be there anymore because this window.onload will be actually storing the next function. So it still is problematic. And jQuery does away with that problem by doing, they do this jQuery document.ready. And that actually lets us know when the page is all set and all good for us to interact with. Let's see here. So if we go here, I've just been looking for a div that has a class not long for this world, and I'm going to hide it when the DOM is actually all loaded up. The nice thing about this versus the window.onload also is that the onload event by itself, just as itself outside of jQuery, that fires when the DOM tree is actually fully created. What that means is it's the onload event is fired after all external resources are fully loaded. So after the page is displaying everything in the browser, I mean like images, video, Flash. So the issue with that is you can have some delays then between the first time you see the page and the onload event. And that, although it's not a huge thing, sometimes you might see pages that load up and look weird and then change in that first second that you see them afterwards, and that's because they just haven't been handling the DOM loading quite correctly. So doing something like the jQuery document.ready, that actually is just going to allow us to start manipulating the DOM right after the DOM tree has loaded, but not while it's finished. Let's see. It's going to let us manipulate the DOM, so it lets the DOM tree load, but then it's going to, after that, start finishing. It's going to finish all the pictures and the images, video, all that stuff is going to load afterwards. So it kind of moves us up a step further in the tree. So we can actually get and manipulate and play with those objects or those elements before, you know, maybe a long, I was going to say a long Flash video, but then I shouldn't use that word here probably in this group, right?
That's okay.
Is it? Okay, that's all right. Good.
We're not going to, pitchfork you or anything.
It's because it'd be kind of hard to pitchfork me through the computer anyway, right?
Oh, we have ways.
Oh, great. Great. I am using a Mac and I'm talking on an iPhone, so you probably could shut me off pretty easily. Yeah.
So, quick question. So for this, for setting this ready function, if we have a function defined, sort of say at the top of the page, so that it's, I guess, if it's defined at the top of the page, will the page render before it sort of parses that JavaScript?
No.
Okay. So if we've defined a function at the top of the page, can we just pass the name of that function into the .ready function call?
Yes.
And that way we don't have to define the function in line?
Yeah. Okay, so if you were looking through people's jQuery code online, you'd find a lot of people that would take this jQuery document.ready function and they'd sort of write the first line right here, this first line. This is not a good program practice, by the way. They'd write this right in the first line, and then on the last line of their JavaScript completely down, they'd write this.
Right.
And that means they wouldn't parse anything between, but that's ugly. So when we work on our project, we'll take a look at how we'd actually use this to really know when you actually want to launch things when you want to. So
yeah. I mean, what I would probably think of is in this function that we defined in line, just call any other functions that need to be called when they're ready, and not put any individual code in here. Exactly.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Or the opposite would be that you could embed this code inside of a function or a method, and that'll be more the approach I take. So we'll take a look at that.
Okay.
All right.
Yep.
Okay. So here's the big kicker. Prototype doesn't always play well with other libraries. It's not completely wrapped. Prototype, if you don't know, is a JavaScript library. It's the foundation of Scriptaculous and and Rico. And it's a great library. Its main focus is really on a lot of utility methods and helping parse arrays and objects. I think it's really useful in that way. And Script Access is its user library. But the oddity about Prototype and jQuery is they both decided to use the $ for their way of interacting with all of their special extended code. So if you wanted to use Prototype and jQuery together, we couldn't really use the $ at this point. We'll tuck this away again. We'll talk about this more later. But at this point in my presentation, and for where you guys are at, you couldn't use the $. So what we need to do is in this way we can just call a jQuery.noConflict, which is another utility method. And what that's going to do is it's going to take the $ and it's going to hand it back to Prototype. So John Resig was smart enough to realize that there might be times when you want to use Prototype and jQuery at the same time. Granted, that's a lot of data to load up, but once they're cached, they're cached. So in this case, again, instead of using the $, then what we would be doing is using the jQuery reference itself, so we couldn't use that $ shortcut. All right? And like I said, tuck that back in your mind because you know what? I don't really like to type out jQuery. I'd rather type out a $. So we'll talk about how that's possible.
So how often do you find in real-world projects that it's useful or necessary to use both jQuery and Prototype? We do use Prototype, I know, in a bunch of places. Yeah.
Well, there might be a couple of times, like let's say you're migrating projects and you've started to like to use jQuery. So you might have them both in there because depending on what your team size is, not everybody in your team might know. So if you have a lot of internal projects that really aren't affecting any external users, it's okay if you're just in your company's bandwidth to load them both up. When would I use Prototype over jQuery? Is that maybe more what you're asking, or are you asking when would I use?
Basically, like, is there a lot of utility functionality that Prototype provides that jQuery doesn't?
We can take a look at that a little bit later if you guys want to in more depth. I feel like there are some cool things that Prototype does with strings and the actual guts of programming that it does well, versus jQuery does some really good things with DOM traversal, and it's really fast. Excuse me. If we take a look at this timeline, actually, down towards 2009, there's this sizzle.js. So that the unique thing about jQuery is that it really is on top of traversing the DOM, and the reason is John Resig worked for Mozilla for a while, and his sole job was a jQuery evangelist. Basically, he got to work for years straight on ramping this sucker up. So he worked a lot on this thing called Sizzle.js, which was the new way that they do traversing inside of it. So it is going to be faster to traverse than Prototype. But when you actually get to maybe needing, like I was saying, the guts of the programming, that really, there's a lot of strength to Prototype that I don't really see so much and use so much within jQuery. I sort of fall back more on just some regular JavaScript methods. Okay. So, yep, it's pretty easy just to walk quick through the APIs of both, though, and just kind of see what are all these methods and utilities that you have inside of Prototype versus jQuery. When it comes to AJAX, I think jQuery has a ton of really simplified helper methods that are really nice that you'd have to code a lot more yourself than Prototype. And the user interface library for jQuery, jQuery used to be a lot smaller than Prototype and Scriptaculous together, but it's starting to blow a little bit more. Although the nice thing is in both those libraries you can just sort of pick which kind of user interface things you'd like to implement. So it's not like you're going to use the whole package by itself. All right? So back to this history then. Back in 2005, John Resig just started writing some helper utility methods that he was just playing around with and figuring it out. And that's when a lot of these libraries started out, when people started needing to do some more AJAX and figuring out how they could fix some of these branchings between browsers. And it was just coined because, as I said, it was just querying the elements. So it was him querying the elements. Released 1.0 in 2006. The user interface library was birthed in 2007. There is a Qt unit testing framework. We're not going to get into any unit testing, but that is available for you guys to play around and figure out with. The sizzle is his revamped CSS. And then the last thing, which is pretty sweet and is a large portion of what I do for work right now, is jQuery Mobile. jQuery Mobile does a good job of being able to do cross. It's just a little mobile framework to be able to do mobile phone applications where they look like applications. Mobile web applications are probably a better term for it. And then you can use something like PhoneGap to wrap that and deploy it to an iPhone or to an Android, or forbid a Microsoft Mango phone or something like that. But anyway, it's a nice little framework, and it was the last thing that he did at Mozilla. He just left recently. I think he went on to go teach or work on some free online education site. So hopefully the releases will keep coming with the speed they have been. There's a pretty big foundation now that takes care of it, and there are people that are in charge of different projects. So I think it'll be around quite a bit. When we go to the API, you'll be able to see there are a lot of sites still using this and are contributing to it. I know actually Adobe is one of them as of late. They just purchased PhoneGap, and they also contribute to jQuery Mobile. So, all right, let's take a look at the actual API then. So I'm going to keep sharing my screen here, but we're going to, all right, see if everybody's got, let's go to the front main page. Okay, jQuery.com. On the top, you'll notice that there's our jQuery and then plugins and UI. Plugins we'll talk a little bit about later, not a ton, but there are some extra plugins that you can download and use for jQuery, which has been one of the prominent features of jQuery versus Prototype. Prototype, you always have to, it seems, fork out money to try to get a plugin for it, or just write the code yourself. Or here, there are already some ground-up plugins. One of those original plugins really was the user interface library. It's not a plugin anymore. It's now really been taken on by the jQuery Foundation. Excuse me. Sorry, I have a little bit of a cold, so please forgive me if I cough a bit. On the front here,
does that UI include the jQuery grid, or is that a separate plugin? That's a good question. I don't know. I haven't used the grid. Okay.
So that's
the plugin.
Okay, that's something you guys can take a look at when we get to playing around towards the end. So,
okay.
The download's right here on the front. You can grab the download. The code that we're going to be using in the labs is just directly connecting to a CDN for us. So API-wise, we can click on documentation, takes us to our main page, or if you just want to go to api.jquery.com. And I think they do a pretty good job of documenting their library. Prototype also does. Dojo is abysmal, so this is a good one. What we'll be doing today is we're going to be going down and checking out a bunch of these different API interactions that we can have, and I'll try to be walking you guys through those so that you can get familiar with it and be able to continue to do more research on your own. Okay, what we're going to do now is, like I said, that first little bit, not a huge amount of talking there. I want to be able to kind of get our hands wet just a tiny bit with our first lab. So if you guys could bring up your IDEs.
Thank you. Please stand by.